All right, well, welcome all. We're assembled here today to celebrate and discuss and launch Isaac Ariail Reed's new book, Power and Modernity, Agency Relations, and the Creative Destruction of the King's Two Bodies, which I can't exactly show you. This is a University of Chicago Press by the Book event, co-organized with the famed seminary co-op. Isaac is a sociology professor at the University of Virginia and author of a prior book called Interpretation and Social Knowledge. I'm Sam Moyn. I teach law and history at Yale. Our proceedings are going to go as follows. I'm going to ask Isaac a series of questions for about a half hour on the premise that you probably haven't read the book, though I'm sure you'll rush to acquire it. And then we'll throw it open and I'll invite you to raise your electronic hands and I'll then recognize you and you can unmute yourself. The goal is conversation and as you'll see, nothing is foreign to this book. And you can weigh in the second part of the conversation, even if you haven't read it. So this book is, I think, of a rare ambition. It's bold and enterprising. I mean, I don't read exactly in the current literature and social theory every last bit of it, but I think it's extraordinary to watch someone across a short book with utter clarity build a social theory from scratch. It's focused on agents and their relationships to one another and the workings of power, familiar topics, but Isaac starts from scratch in dialogue with classic social theory, and in relation to contemporary critical theory too. And it's a pleasure to read. I highly recommend it. The second half of the book turns from this theory crafting exercise, if you will, to a set of stories about the early modern transatlantic space and applies the theory, and we'll get into that as well. So Isaac, congratulations, first of all.
Thank you. Thanks for doing this. I appreciate
it. I'm gonna just ask basic questions so that you can explicate step by step how you build the theory across the chapters and then apply it in the second half so originally. And it will just give, I think, those in the Zoom room a sense of what's at stake, but also, how you proceed as an intellectual. So to begin with, you forged some categories to think about agency and relationships amongst agents. And I want to give you an opening chance to just give us a sense of these categories, especially the categories of rector and actor to begin with. What are those? How are they defined?
Right. So, the story, the theoretical story is that rector sends actor to act or work or labor on rector's behalf, and insofar as they succeed in sending and binding them to a project, then actor becomes agent, and an agency relation obtains between rector and actor. And that agency relation is my way of trying to model power, or one part of quote unquote power relations. So the idea of sending and binding, it's this very simple idea that power is, in one of its forming in one of its ways, power is getting someone to do something else for you. So the rectors and actors, those are positions occupied by people, either individuals or groups of people, in a larger constitution of the social. It can also be categories of people in various forms and organizations, but there are people in there always, because it's persons who have the capacity for action, which is what I'm interested in the I guess in the Arendtian sense of action. Mm-hmm. The one other thing I'll say is that the weird terms rector and actor come from two different places. One, I mean, I really wanted to maintain this commitment that as human beings, we're all actors in the multiple meanings of that term. But I also wanted to talk about agents and agency relations and sending to act for, which is something that's in legal theory and political science, et cetera. But I wanted to talk about them in a way that included this symbolic doubling. So, I think one way to think about this, and I would maybe, if I could write the book a little bit differently, I would emphasize this more. It's like each position, rector sends actor to do something and thereby makes actor into an agent. But that's actually always a double relation, because each position has like people occupying it in relation to other people, and also a totemic representation of like what it means to be a rector. That is what it means to be in a superior position in a hierarchy. And I liked rector because I also liked rector because it sort of signified this kind of notion that the rector has to act with rectitude to justify rule. And also because it was a kind of term that has all these different connotations, so it wouldn't immediately associate with, the government or capital or whatever. It was supposed to be this kind of general term.
Good. I think that fits with what I read. So we're on the same page so far. There is this third character of the other, and I just want to note that and put it to the side just for a second, and get back to it, because I want to ask you, I mean, you forged these categories of rector and actor to get at kind of, a relationship that we can recognize in lots of different settings, and thinking hard about that relationship can give us some insight into a lot of different things, as we'll see. But it's not as if you're forging from whole cloth. And so I wanted to ask about two other framings that some have used that resemble maybe in form, but from which you also depart. And so one is just the kind of ordinary principal agent distinction. Like we have whole bodies of law that are like based on that. And there's, we could get into that, but that existed before the rector actor distinction. And then there's, I think very interestingly, and you indicate that this is worth considering, the German philosopher Hegel's master-slave distinction. And I think that's worth your talking about too, just because this is not just let's say a boringly hierarchical relationship between rector and actor. It is hierarchical, but it also is one in which the two parties evolve and can engage in kind of adversarial relations, or one in which the actor can sometimes have the upper hand over, or at least potentially transform the rector. So talk a little bit about like what's different in rector actor versus principal agent and master slave.
Yeah, that's a good question. So I mean so I have to credit Julia Adams for working through all the agency theory, and I sort of learned it from her. And in a certain sense, the idea is that, and there is a book in sociology actually so it's not just law. I mean, James Coleman's Foundations of Social Theory is all about principles and agents. So what's the idea here? The agency relation, in the sense that like when you send someone to do something for you, a series of problems arise, like maybe they're really just working for their own interests, or actually they know more about the problem than the person who's supposedly hierarchical does, or all these kinds of things. Those all arise. But the principal agent language I see as very tied to a pretty instrumentalist or strategic or sometimes rational choice understanding of what the people who occupy these positions are like. So, I mean, it's interesting. We could kind of get into this question about whether in legal theory there's actually, you know, also the same kinds of sort of normative things operating that I'm so interested in. But I mean, I don't, you know, and you would know more than me there. What I wanted to do though was basically say, like, there are lots of agency problems that we can recognize as having come up from the principal agent literature. And it's very interesting, right? So some of the principal agent literature is like org stuff that's really from the position of the principal, like how do you get your workers not to shirk? But there's also a principal agent literature that's like, it's more, it's, you know, that's from the position of the worker. Like, when are principals abusive? When do they undermine their employees, et cetera? So I was interested in all that, but of course, what I'm interested in is the bringing of, you know, meaning and normative categorizations and claims about justice into the world of power in an attempt to affect the way it binds people. And so rector and actor is supposed to represent, you know, principal agent in conversation with, I guess, cultural sociology and political theory. Which I guess brings me to Hegel. So, and this, you know, I think I have sort of two things to say about this. So, I mean, throughout the book, I describe the relationship between rector and actor as a struggle over redistribution and recognition. So that's a pretty clear debt to the Hegelian tradition of political philosophy. But let's see. You know, I also basically, I guess, what I take from that and try to maybe emphasize more is something that I feel like I learned from Judith Butler a long time ago, which is that the struggle for redistribution and recognition is also this struggle over the representation of authorship, like who gets to really claim to be the object, the author of the thing that is being authored, whether that's like a material object like a record album, or you know, or an artifact like a piece of music, or whether it's some grand political project. So I guess what I would say is I take a lot of that Hegelian stuff on board, but there are really two big things here. I want to, one, focus on that there's always a claim to authorship embedded in struggles over power. And secondly, and okay, right. And I want to say the claims to authorship can be weird. Like weird things can happen in claims to authorship, as you know from the law. I mean, right? Because sometimes the rector wants to claim that the bad act was the actor's fault, right? Right. So we can imagine situations where the rector wants to take credit so that they can justify taking the profits. We can also imagine situations of liability where exactly there's a struggle over authorship, but it works out a different way. And that would also be an act of power. But the other big story here, of course, is that I wanted three categories and not two. And that comes from, you know, at least my interpretation of Frantz Fanon's reading of Hegel, and then Orlando Patterson's criticisms of Hegel. And I guess the way I would put that is that Lord and Bondsman, as it's articulated in the Phenomenology of Spirit, one way to read it is that actually there's this incredible tension in that dialectic, because if you read certain passages in the Hegel, you sort of see, oh, wait, here we see that actor is actually tipping over into being radically dehumanized. And here in this other passage, we see where the bondsman is actually being recognized. And that tension I took to be central to the 20th century interpretation of Hegel, I guess, in political philosophy. So the idea would be that I also wanted to basically split power relations into three categories and say, you know, okay, so rector actor is a little bit Lord and bondsman, but also Hegel's master-slave dialectic has also been used to talk about forms of radical dehumanization, which I would tend to interpret under the category of otherness.
Good. Let's go there because, I reserve that for,
Right.
and now it's perfect. So there's this third category of the other. And so first, could you just lay out, you already kind of have hinted that it's distinguished from the actor and of course from the rector because of people who are othered are pushed in some radically dehumanized direction. And I guess I wanted also to ask, you to talk about whether it's really a distinctive category or a feature of the actors category. You have this brilliant riff on Jonathan Littell's novel, and you definitely engage actual slavery.
Right.
But in both cases, we're talking about people who may be socially dead, but are conscripted into people's projects, namely Rector's projects. So their dehumanization doesn't mean they can't work for us. And so I guess I wanted to get at, is this third category, how is it distinguished from the second, or is it a kind of possible form of the second?
That's a great question. A really, really interesting question. I mean, so I think the answer to that question is that I guess I would sort of answer it in sort of two dimensions. So one is that I wanted to say that the profane exclusion of the other is an exclusion from the dialectical game of rector and actor. So through a variety of, I think there's a lot of different kinds of alterity, right? So, but if we start from the extreme forms in which we are prone to see a lot of violence, like in Littell's novel and in Orlando Patterson's Slavery and Social Death, if we start from those and we start maybe from the notion of the enemy in Carl Schmitt or something like that, we start from these extreme notions, what we see is otherness or alterity is it's possible that there's still agency relations in the sense of working for, but what there isn't is the possibility of being in the game of authorship, sovereignty, claims on wages, being able to stand before the law and say, well, my employer mistreated me, here are my claims. These claims need to be publicly recognized by some third party, et cetera, et cetera. So the category of the other is excluded from the very capacity to make a public claim to a project and therefore to some kind of involvement in the politics of interpretation, let's say. So there's a kind of exclusion from the very politics of interpretation that defines at least extreme forms of alterity. And I guess I would say the most extreme forms of otherness in which groups of people or people categorized in a certain way become available for systematic violence, I would say tends to also be forms of otherness where the claim to be able to be publicly recognized as part of a project is so radically removed that actually the struggle is even to be able to claim humanity, right? To be able to claim to stand before someone else in an intersubjective relation at all and be recognized as another subject. And I guess, so that's the other way in which it's a separate category. And so what I wanted to is reserve for the rector-actor relation all of the inversions that we are familiar with from various kinds of politics, right? Like if there are a lot of actors and they form a union, then they have collective bargaining power, et cetera, right? And yet there's another form where the very possibility of getting into the gang of actors who try for the inversion is removed, right? Maybe an example of that would be in Du Bois's Black Reconstruction, where he talks about capital, white worker, black worker. That would be like why you need three categories.
I love that, and it just allows us to register, in passing, since time flies, that one thing Isaac does in one of the chapters in the first half is to kind of revive existentialist theories of projects and the authorship of collective projects in particular. And Isaac's alluding there to a claim that others are pushed beyond the possibility of authorship, at least in radical alterity. I mean, although even there we can think of, what is the 1619 project about? It's about retroactively awarding authorship to people who built this country, and yet were not able, because of their othering, to claim authorship at the time. Okay, let's go on. So the balance, let's say, of the first half of the book developed these claims, and in particular engages kind of the question of materiality, and in a really bravura chapter, I think it's 4, the question of performativity and how to theorize performance. As Isaac kind of notes in framing that chapter, performativity is theoretically all the rage, but it seems to not be securely grounded to any kind of structural account. It's anything can be performed, or in other versions, forgotten altogether. And what he does through some really interesting takes on Oscar Wilde, among others, in that chapter, is to give a reading of performativity that connects it to kind of the possibility of moving or being moved from a rectorship to actorship, or vice versa. Okay, but let's turn in for a few minutes to the second half, which is very different. And I just want to start off and ask you about what's the status of the first half. Are these more or less universal claims about human relations anywhere and everywhere? Because the second half is somewhat specifically about the early modern North Atlantic, and a set of claims classic for the tradition of social theory of how one might account for and render the distinctive character of modernity, initially at least North Atlantic modernity. But I guess I want to ask, before we get there, is the story of Rector, Actor, Other the totality of power relations, and is it the totality or a partial account everywhere and always, or is it already kind of local and particular in ways that aren't entirely clear before the second half begins?
Right. I mean, I think that's a good and tricky question. I think my claim would be that it's a partial claim about power relations, all in many places and many times, including the non-modern, whatever that is. And so everywhere and always, it's an attempt at a partial rendering of some dynamics that recur across human history. And what the fancy way of saying that is that it's a kind of theoretical vocabulary that doesn't do any explaining by itself, but which allows you to track certain kinds of variation that might be worthy of explaining in a more particular way. So I definitely think that there are rectors and actors and others, outside of the performance into existence of political modernity in the North Atlantic. And my idea is that these long chains of rectors and actors that expand like accordions, you could kind of get a track on people building various kinds of states in the ancient or in the modern world by the length of the chain, and how much you actually can bind long chains of actors into a single chain where everybody is actually following the same rules or whatever. So what I would say about that is that, so what is the kind of universal or general claim there? I think it's just that I do think that the question of agency relations and their symbolization or their partial solution via symbolization, I think that's a recurrent human problem. And I think it's just a way I have of thinking about politics. I mean, even the category of politics, how it is that one binds other people or groups of people into a project. I don't see that as specifically modern or specifically 18th century or anything like that.
That's what I expected. I mean, it makes sense.
Right.
And of course, in your tradition of social theory, we have figures like Max Weber who are extremely generalizing at times, and then, at other times are very interested in accounting for initially at least North Atlantic modernity and maybe, big global modernity in through some transmission process. Okay, so let's turn just briefly then to the second half, which is very different. It's a theory of how the rector actor other dynamic worked in one very large space across several centuries, but heading into kind of revolutionary politics. And in particular, of course, it's a very creative and interesting rehabilitation of Ernst Kantorowicz's theory of the king's two bodies for thinking about the origins of modernity. So please tell us, and as briefly as you can,
Right. Yeah.
what goes on there, what your argument is.
Yeah. I mean, yes, and I think so. I'll say two things, and I'll try to be more concise than I have been so far. So let me first say, right. I mean, I just ran into Kantorowicz or Kantorowicz not intentionally. It's just because when I was studying the early modern English, then British colony of Virginia, I kept finding all these elites whose claims were constantly being made against each other in terms of who stood for the king, who had the signature of the king, who represented the long arm of the king, et cetera. And so what I realized is that the notion that the king has a second body, which is represented in coins and flags and other things, and signatures, especially signatures, was actually a way to solve agency problems. And in this case, in the case of the early modern Atlantic world, in which there's tremendous contingency about the ability of various empires, Spanish, Iroquois, British, et cetera, on the North American continent, to control their agents. That the kind of story of the king's second body, which is that you were acting as a justice of the peace because you have a little piece of the sovereign body, that was a way to seal together these long chains. And these long chains in particular were very difficult to seal together, for example, when it took several weeks or several months to sail across the Atlantic. So when you ask your sort of how you hold empires together, that's sort of what I arrived at when you think of imperial relations, as many people have as agency chains. And so then, what I sort of arrived at is, and I've always been interested in the French Revolution, et cetera, is this notion that, the destruction of the king was not just like cutting Louis XVI's heads off, but it was actually the destruction of a whole symbolic system for holding together these kinds of relations, which then raises the question, what you put in its place when you're claiming that someone is an agent of the state or an agent of a government, or perhaps claiming that they're an agent of the people, right? And that's what I saw in the early American Republic, as it started its march west in the very beginning, when Anthony Wayne fights the Ohio Indians at the Battle of Fallen Timbers. He's imagining himself not as King George Washington's agent, but as the agent of the people. And that struck me as a clue for thinking about political modernity, that there were these new symbolics. But of course, there are a lot of political symbolics in the quote unquote modern era. So what I ultimately wanted to say was that the sort of destruction of the king's two bodies system opened up this sort of negative space into which lots of ways of sealing together rectors, actors, and lots of some very new ways of excluding others could sort of rush in.
Great. No, that's perfect. So the second half of the book is a really illuminating exploration. It, you know, it maybe principally in colonial North America, but also with a chapter about early modern England and revolutionary France, about folks working within the kind of king's two bodies tradition or seeking to replace it. So maybe we could end by just getting you to talk about chapter 5 of the book to give the auditors out there a sense of how you make this work. So the chapter is largely a kind of contrast of two figures, Nathaniel Bacon and Herman Husband, and how they are both appealing to absent present authority, rectors, but they do so in radically different ways. And in Husband's case, you very, I think, brilliantly show ones that are very fateful for modern history and for modernization. So could you just describe those two gentlemen and what kinds of moves they make in the same place, roughly a century apart?
Right. Yeah. So for sure. And maybe I could just start by saying, Nathaniel Bacon Jr. is the center of Bacon's rebellion in 1676 in the colony of Virginia, and Herman Husband is a kind of millenarian preacher who participates first in acts of regulation directed at the British government, then in the American Revolution, and then in rebellions against the new federal government in the US. So these are both sort of figures of rebellions, and they are sort of leaders in the rebellions, and they articulate political vision as part of their justification for rebellion, etc. Bacon is playing the game of the king's two bodies. His claim is effectively, I am the agent of the king. The governor of Virginia is not the agent of the king. And Bacon is an interesting hybrid figure, and he's puzzled historians for a long time. He, sort of has other aristocrats, tenant farmers, black and white in his rebellion. But his rebellion is really about trying to articulate a more violent approach for the English colony against the Susquehannocks and the Occaneechi tribes. So he's sort of like, on the one hand, inaugurating a certain kind of otherness that would like iterate through many centuries of violence. And on the other hand, he's sort of not fully legible in what we would call modern political terms. And I think he was rhetorically very good at playing the game of the king's two bodies. He convinced a lot of people to do a lot of things by basically saying the governor of Virginia isn't illegitimate. And he even says to his men at one point, if the king's men come from England to put down our rebellion, you have to swear to keep fighting for me for as long as I need to explain to the king's men that we're really fighting for them. So there's this sort of whole triangle of the king. And in contrast to that, Herman Husband is a Jeffersonian populist of sorts. And what I tried to show is that in his sermons, he's very concerned with these same problems of delegation and rule, which I was obsessed with in the first part of the book. But instead, he elaborates a myth of the people. And he has this notion that the prince of the new perfect America, he gives up on the actual US of A, which he says is completely controlled by Eastern financiers who are unfair to small farmers. And a new perfect America will be founded in an empty West after the land is gotten by war or trade, he says, from the Indians. And in that place, everything will bubble up from the people. And that will sort of constitute rule, right? What I was trying to show in contrasting them is that they're in both cases, we see symbolic solutions to recurrent agency problems. And what Herman Husband is completely sort of vexed about is this idea that the justification for the rector at the very top of his fantastical American government has to somehow be the body of the people, right? So that's his that, and so I mean, I think Christian millenarianism is a big part of early American politics. The elites like ancient Rome, the men who fought in the American Revolution, most of them fought in it, understood it as in Christian terms. So I tried to talk about that. But what I really was trying to show is, here we see again and again real political problems of agency, violence, law, etc. But the way in which people are being bound to each other is figuration, myth, fantasy about what makes an honest person, what makes an honest politician versus a dishonest one, etc. So in a certain sense, that's my sort of understanding of politics in the first part of the book applied to the second problem.
Okay, that's really helpful. Let me ask a last question before turning to the crowd. It's sort of the question, what then on your account is let's say modern about modernity? Here's what I mean. You close the book with an account of this creative move that husband makes, and then lots of other creative destructions of the king's two bodies. But it seems like the move that of finding a rector in the body of the people is and could have been available at any time in any place. And there's some discussion of the fact that this is the edge of an empire, and that matters for the kind of precipitation of both of the positions you just canvassed. But on the other hand, it doesn't seem like that wildly creative. Once you're in a delegation relationship, to kind of switch your understanding of who's ultimately in charge. And yet, of course, that is central to the way we think about modernity. So I guess I'm trying to understand that this theory helps us redescribe a move that husband and others make at a certain critical juncture in human history, and you explore it, not just in his case, but in the moment of the French Revolution and so forth. But does it also beg a kind of question about why was it imaginable to make that move at that time, in that place, and then from there and so many other locales around the world?
Yeah, it's a good question. I want to say a couple things about this. So I mean, I think specifically to sort of husband and the Jeffersonians, right? I think they are troubled by a problem which is certainly maybe not unique to the last 200 years and has been available throughout human history at many points. And I would be very open to this idea. But husband is trying to solve via sort of mythology the problem that the quote unquote people, as he's imagining them, are at the bottom and at the top of the chain of delegation simultaneously. So I think in that sense, he's really, and what he's struggling with is that he no longer believes that the king as the delegate of God will care paternalistically for the people. Instead, he's obsessed with how can it be that the people will not vote for dishonest politicians now that they have the vote or something, right? I mean, that's right. So I would say that the people at the very top and at the very bottom of the imagination is a problem, and it's not a problem that vexed Nathaniel Bacon in the same way. He was not vexed by this problem of the people are the very top and the very bottom, that the powerless are the best source of authority. He definitely didn't think that. He was sort of an aristocrat who just thought he was better at being the king's agent, right, or something. So I think that's interesting and new. What I also want to say though is that what do we make of the negative space that's opened up by killing the king? You know, which is Michael Walzer's question from 1992, et cetera. And what I make of it is that, contrary to how we often think about political modernity, the mythological solution of agency problems doesn't go away, but proliferates into many, 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 many more myths for trying to solve agency relations, build long chains of power, make profit, etc. And that means that what we actually see is a dispersion of myth and fantasy throughout the modern era as a part of politics. So it's not like, well, we got the era of the people, and with that era, we got like political realism. Like it's the opposite. It's that the king was the fantasy of the king as the father of the nation is destroyed, and in its place comes everything else. You know, and that's the persistence of myth in the modern. And so I think that's what I want to say as a redescription, is the persistence of myth and enchantment in the modern as a response to agency problems.
Okay, well, so I know that everyone on this Zoom has a better sense of the book and of its range, and I hope that there are many questions that you may want to pose, Isaac, even if you have not read it. So please identify yourselves and I will recognize you. Does anyone want to go first? Okay, Stephen White.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, sorry. Okay,
That's
so
fine.
just raise your hands and I'll, and if you want to chat me, you can, if you don't have the relevant capacity or do something's wrong, just feel free or just write it. Okay, I see Wissam also. So let's do Stephen, Angel, Wissam, Fatma. Stephen, why don't you unmute and go ahead.
Thanks for the great sort of introductory set of questions. And I've talked with Isaac about the book to some degree and have great admiration for it. I want to pick up sort of in the questions at the end where you're thinking about what replaces the king's body as the source of power that's both effective and legitimate. And you seem to want to keep that note that there's something about the notion of the body that's crucial to that, the body of the people. And I wonder whether maybe you too quickly jump to that notion that we need to keep the body. I mean, you need to keep the body in all kinds of ways in thinking about social political relations. But in the notion of effective, legitimate power, I wonder whether you give up too easily the notion of something that has a kind of mythic dimension to it, but that remains more symbolic. And here I'm thinking of somebody you know well, that is Hannah Arendt, and her notion of power as communicative power. That is, it's something generated intersubjectively. Obviously, Habermas picks up on that, but it's something generated intersubjectively that I, as agent in your sense, could think of myself as embodying, and but in quotation marks, in the sense that I could internalize that symbolic quality of that sense of the legitimacy of that power. So I guess that's my question is this kind of yearning for embodiment here in the notion of that comes from the king, is that as necessary as you seem to make it at the end?
Right. Yeah, it's a great question, and I'm going to answer it in the sort of following way. I mean, so I guess I'm really interested in various figurative and metaphorical bodies that seem strewn across the modern world. So on the one hand, I don't actually think that there's a certain approach to the modern world in which there's a reduction in the modern world to the physical body in various ways. Some of this comes out of Foucault's work, read in a certain way, and other places as well, that what happens in the world is a kind of reduction of what was once myth and fantasy and mysticism to expertise about bodies, let's say. And I don't want to say that about embodiment. I think that happens, of course, in various ways. What I want to say is that I think that various metaphors of various bodies are important because of modern politics continues to be a politics of figuration as a way of sealing together large political communities. So what I want to say is that, I disagree with Habermas's interpretation of Arendt. I think Arendt is quite on about the dramaturgical aspect of appearing before another. What I would say is that dramaturgical aspect draws on metaphors of the body. So, I agree that this is actually an unsettled issue, and it's certainly not solved at the end of the book. But I guess I'm increasingly convinced that these things that we regard as dead metaphors, body politic, body of law, body of work, I don't know. I'm not sure they're dead metaphors, or they're zombie metaphors or something, right? And so I guess what I would say is, I agree with you about communication. I'm just not sure that the very achievement of political communication that you're referring to doesn't partially rely on a kind of reference to a set of metaphors, which sort of like we like to pretend that we've gotten away from, but we haven't really. And just as a kind of silly and fun way to say this, we still teach political theory and with that front piece to Leviathan. Everyone still finds that an interesting, compelling, terrifying, or horrible image in some sense. And I guess what I'm just interested in is, I don't think that the image in that sense ever went away from modern politics. But I would say I'm very interested in it as a metaphor and not just as the use of actual bodies, laboring bodies that can commit kinds of violence. But I also just think the imagination of the body. Maybe I'm just too overwhelmed by those huge paintings from the French Revolution, that hang in the museums in France, where everyone's trying to repicture the body of the nation. But I guess my point is that that these metaphors are a central way of sticking together rectors and actors, and a central way of excluding others.
Thanks.
All right, thanks, Stephen. Offline, I've been urging Isaac to tell me, what he thinks of these French thinkers like Claude Lefort and Marcel Gauchet, who in the late 70s had this whole seminar around and closely read Kantorovic's book and developed their own theory, coming out of their roots and, Merleau-Ponty's theory of the body and the flesh of a kind of democratic kind of bodily politics. Okay, but let's turn to, is it Angel or Angel?
It's Angel.
Okay, hi.
Hi, Isaac. Thank you so much for the book. I really like the rector, actor, other categorization. It's given me a lot to really think about it. There's a lot I really love about it. So the question I have is to kind of think about those categories and the extent to which there's something objective about them versus the extent to which they're a matter of interpretation. And so, so for instance, I'm thinking about some white Americans who over the last many years have felt perhaps that they are others in the sense that they are they've been disenfranchised, even stigmatized for their very conservative religious beliefs and for a sense of being looked down on the East Coast elite as not being educated. Think about the January 6th insurrection. Were they others in that act, or were they actors in that act? I guess what I'm getting at is that I can see a situation where, from the standpoint of many people in the society, we would perceive them to be actors, to be at the center of power, but they've interpreted their situation as being others. And I just wonder about, what are the political implications of that? Of, when you've got leaders who kind of whip people up into understanding themselves to be others rather than to being actors. Does that dissolve the distinction between actors and others? Analytically, would you, as the, kind of the outside observer, be able to kind of impose some objectivity and say, no, these people are actors and these people are others? So that's kind of the essence of my question.
Yeah, it's a great one. Thank you so much for that. So a couple of things. I mean, in the world of, my idea first would be that in the world of crisscrossing agency relationships and variable formats of attributing authorship, I guess I would posit that, a recurrent aspect of certain parts of modern politics is the politics of resentment, as maybe January 6th is like a very fierce and concrete version of something that is a much broader process, which is certain political elites from certain positions of power, telling certain people that they have been othered, and therefore interpolating them into an agency relation where they act on behalf of the rector. And I guess one way to think about that is that January 6th was not so much surprising as a sort of particularly concrete manifestation of a political process whereby the subjective naming of otherness enable the establishment of agency relations in a very particular way, in the sense that they were sent as agents into the Capitol, right? I mean, that's the first thing I would say about that. The other thing I would say is that, I think that, there is this, like, so you could ask this sort of interesting question, like the way I would put, so I think there are objective relations of power that we can talk about who has which capacities, and, whether one is actually disbarred by law from doing X or Y or Z. And those things are real. And I think the theory could account for those because it has a clear relational dimension. Right. So it's relatively clear that, and we could think about forms of economic othering being crisscrossing with forms of cultural othering, et cetera, and there being a kind of amalgam. What I will say is I think it's interesting to think about how often in the politics of resentment, and this is where interpretation gets really complicated, but I guess I would say it's interesting how often in the politics of resentment, certain losses of cultural authority or normativeness are interpreted as radical losses of power. And so I think that's where you sort of get into this question. I think universities in the USA are less normatively Christian than they were 100 years ago. So it's interesting to think why that is interpreted as a format of why that is sort of reinterpreted as a format of radical othering or something, rather than a sort of reduction in certain kinds of cultural authority, right? I mean, that would be the story that I would want to tell. To tell that story, you would have to kind of develop some accounts of authority and power in relationship to each other, which I'm trying to sort of work on now, but I think you could still use the same schema. The last thing I will just say is that I think that, conspiracy theories are good examples of fantasies about rectors, actors, and others that may be quite distant from the relations of rectors and actors and others that exist in the society. So conspiracy theories, for example, are often in the business of doing this massive inversion where they take the profaned others of the society and imagine that they are the true rectors who are directing, so these emerged obviously around Obama, for example, right? And so I guess I would just say that I want the theory to be able to account for what I think you would call objective power relations. And I do think that those things are real, but I also want to see how those are inflected by the traveling of fantasies of rectors and actors and others that circulate through the society. And I don't see any way to kind of get into the question of power politics without having some account of how compelling some of those fantasies are to some people, precisely because that's actually what makes them into agents. I mean, why is anybody an agent of anything? Partially because they kind of get fixed in a picture of the world, I think would be my response.
All right, excellent question. So right now we have 6 on the queue, and my thought is we could have 3 groups of 2. If Wissam and Fatma could ask their questions in succession, and then Isaac can intervene.
Okay. So I have read the book twice now. I think I was lucky enough to read it when it was just a draft, and I've talked to Isaac a lot about these ideas over many years. So my question is about the application of the theory and potentially a critique of it, and I am going to use the Israel-Palestine case to talk about this. One of the things that I found to be difficult in the book, even though it is effectively partially a theory of modernity, is that it's been difficult for me to draw out the ideas about social transformation and reconfiguration. And so the question is, okay, using the European Jews, the Zionist movement, the movement into the Israeli state, eventual domination of Palestinians, and Israeli state's reliance on the US, how do we go from the Jews being, radical other, facing near annihilation, to powerful rector? And today, is the Israeli state a rector and the settlers their actors and the Palestinians the excluded others? And this kind of speaks to, is it Angel's point? I'm still pretty certain that many Israelis and Jews throughout the world see themselves as radically excluded others. So this implies kind of a second question or potential critique, which is that your categories, your conceptual vocabulary kind of takes a snapshot in a moment of time rather than being able to capture the dynamism and reconfiguration and reformation of power dynamics, especially in terms of international affairs. Or do you think that's unfair, or do you think I've misunderstood the theory?
And I now continue with my question, I guess, also from the Middle East. So obviously Wissam and I are put together here as the Middle Eastern voices. Wonderful, Isaac. I really like the way in which you explain Western European or Northern Atlantic modernity with its own history. First, I want to draw attention to the fact that Kantorovich and all the others are in Germany, and Germany, like the Ottoman Empire and Russia, was never a part of Europe, or at least they thought it wasn't, and it was the center of the Romantic tradition through modernity, and I think that's for a reason, because there were many, I think, unacceptable elements in that context that were different from France and England culturally. So that I want you to sort of at least comment on the sort of the Germanic influence in the way the two bodies were formed. Because what I think is, just to take it one step further, when you say, and I'm coming from a post-colonial sort of Du Boisian perspective here, when you take the three categories, basically the actor and rector, I totally get. But when you add the third one, other, aren't you defining the other in relation to actor and rector? And by doing so, doesn't it become then somehow tainted, let's say, in the definition by how you have constructed actor and rector in the first place? This is also, I think, related to what Wissam and what others are saying. If you do not have your categories as socially constructed over time across space and in relation to meaning, then it becomes very hard to explain change with it, even though you do a very good job of explaining things as they stand. So that is what I wanted to ask you. I mean, I personally think, and I'm writing a theory book too, but mine starts with Du Boisian double consciousness. And I started at the ontological level, not the epistemological level. So I was going to ask you how you would at least take care of those biases that I think would go into the category of the other, the way you have constructed it theoretically. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for those two questions. So, I mean, I guess I'll start with Sam's question. I mean, the only way, I mean, the description of the relationship of the settlers to the, well, let's not say to the ruler, let's say the rulers of the Israeli state, because I want this to be, I want rectors and actors and others to be positions that are occupied by people and groups of people. So I agree with that description of rector, actor, other. That sounds exactly right. The only way that I would complicate it would be to say that presumably, if one wanted, I mean, I am not an expert in the history of Israeli politics in particular, but I would point out that there is a long-standing political relationship between certain constituents of Israeli Jews who are invested in settlement of the West Bank and removal, and certain elected politicians. So I would point out only that I guess the settlers are the actor agent, but there is of course that double relationship where the politicians they send into office are in a certain sense dependent on them. And certain state subsidies, of course, flow in certain ways. So I think the description of rector, actor, other as applicable there is exactly right. I would just say that, again, you know, politics is also in these sort of complex ways in which the rector-actor relationship can be subject to certain inversions and demands. And if you have a particular interest as a particular kind of Israeli politician, you would be subject to you know, I mean, in a sense, you would feel yourself to be the agent of the settlers or something. That would be the only, I don't know the answer to that question, but I would certainly ask it that way. Yeah, I don't think that, but I don't think that the idea that, I mean, I'm very interested in the question of whether and how, I mean, I guess the way I would put your question, I think it's possible for the theory to account for it. I mean, it's certainly possible for the theory to account for certain governments acting as agents of other governments. I mean, that seems to work inside the theory. I guess what I would say is I would just repose your question as a question of memory and politics. I mean, you know, I don't know the answer, and there may be people on this call who are better experts on this than me, but I mean, the relationship between the memory of otherness and maybe certain experiences of anti-Semitism and the desire for there to be the iron fist of the Israeli state seems like a worthwhile topic of discussion. So I don't think that it's true that I don't in the book talk about historical change in memory as happening simultaneously, but I don't think that the framework would disbar that, although perhaps I'm not adroit enough with it in the sense that it's laid out in this sort of categorical way. But I don't, you know, I guess what I would say is the construction of state power in the modern era repeatedly involves rectors, actors, and others, and the consolidation of nation states has happened over and over again via the scapegoating and projection of lack of humanity on lots of different kinds of others. So I don't think that that would disbar. I think the theory would provide a way to think about all kinds of states that way. I think. I guess this comes to the ontology and epistemology question. I mean, it's certainly true. You know, I mean, Fatima, I want to say, I mean, I think it's certainly true that I think that you and I would have written this book very, very differently. It's certainly true. I want to say the book is an attempt in certain parts to, you know, merge the theories of power that, I mean, I see there being these two huge and varied traditions of thinking about power in sociology. One of them is what I would call the tradition of logistics, and which is, you know, Max Weber and Charles Tilly, and how do you get state agents to behave the way you want them to, and how do you collect taxes, et cetera. And that's a tradition that looks at power in the form of the powerful and their logistics. Although it has been a left-wing tradition and it's been part of a contentious politics tradition. And then there's the tradition that thinks about power from the position of the other. And it's true that the book tries to sew these two traditions together. So I think what I want to say in answer to your question is that I think that you're right, that the book is not, it does not operate strictly from the kind of, it is not the book is not a new statement on the ontology of otherness. I think you are correct about that. The book is an attempt to develop and learn from certain theories of how power operates, looked at from the position of the other. It's like an attempt to sort of build those into a kind of conversation with the state making and culture tradition or something like that. So I think that's my answer to that question. I mean, you know, in the sense that you are correct that the book does not stay with the position of the other all the way through. And so it would, I think you're right that the book is not written that way. It does, however, try in a certain sense to kind of like build some account of otherness into an account of agency relations. And that's because I think, right, I mean, I think I agree with, you know, Zygmunt Bauman and Paul Gilroy that there are certain kinds of radical alterity that seem to be a product of the modern era. And so I'm trying to build those in simultaneously to paying attention to what I guess one might call the Weberian tradition or something. And then the book may succeed or may fail in that regard, but that's kind of what I'm attempting to do. I think if you could, you know, and I try to talk about a history of othering in early modern North America, which I think, so in a certain sense, I think you could do that with Sam's question for the 20th century. You know, one of the things that happens in British North America is that in the 200 years, which, you know, there's, you know, the governor of Virginia in 1676 has all these alliances with the Occaneechi and the Susquehannocks, et cetera, et cetera. By the time you get to 1794, that's unimaginable to the rectors of the American state, right? So one can imagine there's been a transformation in how the others are here, right? And I you know, one could think about other forms of alterity in the 20th century as also being subject to that kind of transformation. You know, particularly, for example, insofar as the American state and the Israeli state are sort of engaged in some kind of complicity.
So, you know, we're meant to end in about 5 minutes. So I think our best course is
for
me
5:30,
to,
I think we have to fly. Oh yeah, sorry.
okay, no, fair enough. So I'll maybe have 3 now. Timothy and sorry, Anne, and then Timothy, and then Mitchell. And then we'll see where we are. Anne, do you want to, are you still on and want to unmute yourself?
Yeah, I'm here. So this is great. Thanks, Isaac. And and Samuel. So my question is a theoretical question. As you were speaking about authorship and interpretation in this theory, I was wondering what you think about whether it's the, whether it fits well or it doesn't. Roland Barthes kind of reader, like in the position of reader response theory, the idea of death of the author, and if the kind of interpretive act of the reader towards the author, like the death of the author, this is now mine, plays a part in your theory. In a way, I could kind of see maybe like a hint of it with, thinking about, well, Bacon revolts from, was it Tryon or something, and then husband, has this kind of moment with his own revivalism, but even contemporary examples, it might even play into the previous two questions. So that is my question, Roland Barthes.
Okay, Timothy and Mitchell. Let's just collect the three and see.
Yep.
Hi, thank you for this. This is a question that might be somewhat similar to earlier questions, so feel free to ignore it if you think you already answered it. But from a specifically sort of outsider historian's perspective, who's nonetheless interested in all these questions, I'm wondering if you have a sense of what ultimately drives shifts between these different symbolic chains, right? So when you described husband, it seemed like there's some active process of playing with the existing symbolic order that then has these fortuitous effects. So it's within the signification that then sparks this new possibility of a different regime. But then thinking of a sort of different description of these shifts, like the Sartre, the critique of dialectical reason, you have the same sort of shifts in process, only they're driven by something concrete like material scarcity. So then you go to a process of everything being broken up into seriality, then the groups fuse, and then you have a new rector under terror. Mm-hmm. So I guess what I'm wondering is, do you have some sense of whether it's like a straightforward Marxist material scarcity issue, or whether it's all just play within the symbolism that sort of like a kaleidoscope configures? Or are you trying to come up with some theory that is actually capable of being much more capacious and saying yes to everything? Different historical moments might have different dynamics. I'm just trying to give us a language of actually describing them without falling into those fundamentalist Marxist versus symbolic other traps.
Okay, Mitchell.
Great. Hello, Isaac. It's nice.
Oh, hey, Mitchell.
Nice to see a very small square of you.
It's good to see you.
Yeah, man. So I was listening to people and I was thinking about this question of perspective. And when I started engaging with your stuff, it seemed obvious to me that the question of within chain and between chain relations was really important for understanding what you were trying to do. So I thought it would be cool if you would just maybe comment on that. It might be sort of helpful. And then I wonder if it might change things if we were thinking about a mode of economic production in which most of the grunt work, as it were, was not done by human beings, but was done by machines. Do you think the theory would hold up under such conditions? That's it.
Great. Okay, I can go now, right? That's the yeah. So interestingly, I think the first in this batch of questions and the last one from Mitchell go together. So this is a right. So this is a humanist book in a certain way, and I think that I am very interested in signification, and I think that authorship is never secure and always emerges from social networks. But nonetheless, I think that human beings in groups and in individuals do want to claim to be the authors of their own actions. We could have an argument and about how, whether that's something that's modern or not. I think probably not, but it has certain extreme forms in the modern. But yeah, I'm not on board with the total death of the author. I'm on board with lots of those signification theories, but I think that the demand for public recognition of authorship is the great thing that unseats Roland Barthes, at least at his most post-structural. That brings me to Mitchell's second question. So, I mean, okay, now the Arendtian is really going to come out. I think, right, that insofar as there is human natality and people are capable of inventing new and different ways to live together, so not only starting new projects, but starting new meta projects for how human beings organize their projects, that if that Arendtian idea of what makes humans human and what makes them political is true, which I tend to think that it is, then I don't see agency relations going away. Even if the embeddedness of agency relations in certain kinds of, we could imagine the embeddedness of agency relations in certain kind of work that turns human beings into more and more like machines would get less. So, I guess that's, I'm just not enough of a, Marxist to sort of think that, because I guess I just see the autonomy of the political as being as sort of part of this book, in the particular sense that there will still be projects, and whenever there are human projects, there are going to be rectors and actors. Now, we could imagine that rector-actor relations, in some quantitative sense, could become less dominating if certain aspects of the economy changed. I would be very comfortable with that idea. But I don't think that agency problems will go away. So because I think that there's human natality or something like that, right? And that even if most of the work was done by robots, there would still be human politics about human beings, how they live together, how they understand each other, how they, how they raise their children in one set of meanings rather than another. So I don't see it kind of it not applying, but I could certainly see an argument that there are certain eras or spaces in society in which rector-actor other relations are highly determined by certain work requirements, and other situations in which they're not. I'm comfortable with that argument. I'll come back to within chain, between chain in just a second, because that's really important. But to Timothy's question, I think I am going for the third thing, the more capacious account of transformation. How can it be grounded so it's not just a kind of everything goes? And here I have to admit that the theory is partial. It's a slice. And, and I think we've heard some good critiques of the way in which it's a slice. What I would say is I'm interested in cultural change insofar as it's a reconfiguration of symbols. That's like one of the two that you offered, Timothy. But I see that reconfiguration of symbols as often urged on by the emergence of new or the new agency problems. I want the agency problems to ground the account of how semiotics gets transformed. Now, agency problems, of course, themselves always come with representations of agency problems, so it sort of doubles back on itself. Mitchell, I think between chain and within chain is really important because it gets at something which I didn't talk about well enough in the book. I sort of start the theorizing of otherness from like these extreme examples, like the most, and we've talked about this, invisibility, dehumanization and enslavement, enemy in war, scapegoats. These are all sort of radical forms of alterity. I think that's like, those are like the boundaries of the formats of alterity. But there's lots of ones in between where, and that's the question, in fact, of politics, right? I mean, so for example, obviously there are like competitions between chains of rectors and actors when there are party competitions in elections. And then of course we have this question, are those parties actually embedded in a meta project to the point that, they have some complicity across the chains? One could make a certain argument that that complicity has deteriorated, let's say. So I mean, I think that that's how I would describe within chain and between chain. I think it's the essential question, and the only thing I would beg patience. I mean, I'm just starting. I want to come up with more things to talk about in this way. But I think the first thing to do would basically start from the other end of mundane otherness, which is just like there are lots of projects in any given society, and there are sets of people who are other, but who are not labeled in this extreme way as profane other to various projects. And that would be like the counterbalance to this book.
All right. Well, I think we should call it now, with apologies to people who wanted to ask questions. This has been amazing, I think, and I wanted to leave time to thank Ryan Lucier for organizing this and doing the logistics, and of course, above all, thanking Isaac for writing such a fantastic book and bringing us together and starting a conversation that I think could go on much longer today and will go on for years as the scholarly debate about these things evolve. So thanks to Isaac. Do you want to say anything in closing, Isaac, or just bask in the adulation?
No, I do want to say something in closing. I mean, first I want to thank Ryan and Sam for making this happen. And I want to thank the audience for zooming in when I am 100% confident that everybody on this call is exhausted with Zoom. So I just want to say that that does not go unrecognized by me, that this is one more Zoom call in May is a high bar. So I really feel very, very flattered by that. The last thing I want to say is that my reaction to the questions is actually that there's just so much more that I want to work on and write about, and so many things. I mean, I have to say my honest reaction to the questions is, maybe the process whereby books get written is interesting, and maybe complicated, but boy, I sort of wish I had been able to hear these questions or think about them in this way before I started, because it seems to me that they've been right on point. So I think there's some way in which the questions and the criticisms today have made me feel understood, and precisely have addressed the kind of limitations of the thought that's in the book. I really enjoyed that, and I think they've been quite precise in that way. So all I can say is, I hope you'll read the next one.
All right, congratulations to Isaac, and thanks
much
to everyone for coming. See you at the next Isaac book event, whenever that transpires. I'm looking forward to it.